Ledamot för Kristdemokraterna, och min ära att hälsa er alla hjärtligt välkomna till detta seminarium, lunchseminarium. Vi har en timme på oss. Frågan om dödshjälp är ju alltid aktuell. En känslig fråga där vi har, tror jag, alla våra olika ingångar. Jag har själv varit engagerad i många år för människovärdesfrågor. Jag har besökt hospice i Storbritannien, London, som har varit en av föregångarna, inspiratörer för många runt om i världen för att bygga upp värdig vård i livets slutskede. Och där fick jag faktiskt inspirationen att också, det hade man ett särskilt initiativ i parlamentet att försöka få att så många som möjligt, helst alla parlamentsledamöter, skulle besöka en hospiceavdelning. Vi har försökt göra det till en viss del i Sverige. Jag har olika skeden arrangerat studiebesök på Ersta, som är väldigt duktiga här i Stockholm. Och det intressanta är ju att i de tillfällen som vi har varit där så har överläkaren och personalen berättat att man under alla år så har man nästan aldrig varit med om att en patient i livets slutskede inlagd frågar om dödshjälp, utan man frågar om livshjälp med smärtlindring. Idag så we have a special guest here and you will be introduced in a short while. Det som behövs är ju att få information, och idag kommer vi få information från andra länder och erfarenheter, och det är jätteviktigt i min uppfattning att vi bibehåller den linje vi har i Sverige att inte legalisera dödshjälp. Så det är min ingång. Per Evert, som leder Klapphamninstitutet, du ska få berätta lite om mer verksamhet och också om våran talare. Genom välkomstapplåd.
Det kommer så många politiker och andra personer här inifrån huset till den här samlingen om viktiga frågor naturligtvis. Vi i Klapphamninstitutet, tankesmedjan, har jobbat mycket och ganska intensivt med den här frågan i 2 år. För 2 år sedan så presenterade vi den första sammanställningen på svenska av den modell som används i Oregon i USA. Och Dr Komrad kommer att beskriva den lite tydligare idag också. Den finns inte mera på papper, det här är sista exet, men den finns att läsa på klapphamninstitutet.se. Och dagens gäst är här på Skandinavien-turné. Vi och några organisationer till har haft glädjen att kunna flyga över honom för detta. Han var i Norge igår för 2 seminarier i parlamentet och på universitetet. Och idag är han här och imorgon på Karolinska institutet. And Dr. Komrad is a practicing psychiatrist, and he has been a member of the American Psychiatric Association and their ethical committee for a number of years, and influential in their position against euthanasia. So we are very thankful for having you here today and look forward for your speech. And we're going to end this at 1 o'clock, so you can rush on to your other appointments. And hopefully we'll have some time for questions in the end as well. So a hand for Dr. Komrad.
Thank you also very much for inviting me. Thank you to the members of Parliament, to the various sponsoring organizations like the Contagion Institute. I'm really very honored and actually particularly appreciative that you're allowing me to address you in English because I do not speak Swedish. And unfortunately I couldn't return the favor to you if you came to speak in my parliament. I don't think that we would be able to understand if you spoke Swedish, so I couldn't return the favor. I'm most grateful. So I'm here today with a particular mission, and my mission is to try and share with you some of the actual real-world experience, the actual data of countries, specifically my country, and particularly Oregon, Canada, and to some extent Belgium and the Netherlands, to show you what is happening in this remarkable social experiment that is going on with some dramatic results, things that are not theoretical, but actually facts on the ground as to what can happen if a nation or any kind of a jurisdiction decides to proceed with this remarkable change, really in the history of civilization, a change in which one group of people, ironically of all groups, physicians, are given the power and the responsibility, indeed the duty, to decide whether or not certain other people should be killed and to have the responsibility to actually kill them. This is a dramatic change in civilization. I'm going to speak to you a little bit about the history of a ethical tradition that's older than Lutheran, that's older than Christianity, the 2,300-year-old tradition of medical ethics. So as Herman Melville said, woe to him who seeks to please rather than to appall. And my mission today is to actually give you some information that I can share with you a sense of being appalled. Because as you heard, I'm a psychiatrist with 35 years of practice in psychiatry. My specialty actually is dealing with suicidal people and people who want to die. This is my daily bread and butter. But my other specialty is as an ethicist. And I've spent my career as an ethicist, and really throughout that career, this is the single most important ethical issue that I have ever encountered, an issue that actually has transformed me from being an ethicist and a scholar into an activist. That's how important I think it is, because, as Camus reminds us, there is but one truly philosophical problem, and that is suicide, which is very much at the intersection of my two interests, psychiatry and philosophy. And we are talking about suicide. I really want to make that clear. The CDC, which is the National Public Health Institute of the United States, very simply defines suicide as death caused by self-directed behavior with an intention to die. That's the definition, and that, in fact, is what we are talking about here. People who have the intention and desire to die and want to make that happen. And they want to make that happen by medicalizing that decision and the procedures, by turning to physicians as a way of killing them. But much is in this debate and trying to change the very nature of language itself. One of our English classics, Alice in Wonderland, in that book, Humpty Dumpty, says, "A word means what I want it to mean, nothing more and nothing less." So many different words have been mobilized in this discussion. Things like physician-assisted suicide, voluntary euthanasia, compassionate assistance to die, physician-assisted dying. Canada, the preferred term is MAID, or medical assistance in dying. In Australia, it's called Go Gently, Australia. Death with dignity is a particularly popular one. After all, who doesn't want to have dignity in the midst of life, let alone death? And medical murder has been used by some. We had a notorious character back in the 1980s in the United States, Jack Kevorkian, some of you might recognize that name, who developed these suicide machines for sick people that they could hook themselves up to and start an IV and kill themselves. He wanted to introduce the word medicide. Thank goodness that never caught on. And then there's this curious organization, the World Federation of Right-to-Die Societies, that exists now, particularly in Europe, that's trying to promote this word, dignicide. In my opinion, all of this is verbicide. Organized obfuscation. By the way, this organization here, sorry, I skipped that slide, this World Federation of Right-to-Die Societies, the executive director, who's an oncologist, says with almost transparent irony, "I always refrain from using the word killing. You terminate life, and actually, more than that, you terminate suffering. Get used to that idea because it is counter-human a little bit." And yes, indeed, to be able to metabolize these ideas, you have to get into somewhat of a counter-human space. So let's go over the terminology we're using here. In increasing levels of moral complexity, the basic level that is already the status quo in acceptable medical ethics, and actually has been done for centuries, is a physician, the doctor, getting out of the way of death, terminating treatment, allowing the natural process of death to occur. And for this, we call that assisted dying. That actually is true state-of-the-art, medically, ethically acceptable medical practice. Pulling the plug, if you will, typically in accompaniment with state-of-the-art palliative care, something which is very highly developed, often underused, often underfunded, often underavailable and inaccessible to patients, but nevertheless a very, very effective and powerful way to allow people compassionate address of their suffering using palliative care. The second level, which is more controversial, we call physician-assisted suicide. This is where the doctor writes a prescription, gives it to the patient for lethal medication. The patient has the prescription filled and takes the medication at the time and place of their own choosing. And that may or may not be witnessed, it may or may not be coerced. This is the practice in those jurisdictions in the United States, which I will show you shortly, that allow this physician-assisted suicide.
Oregon?
What's that?
Oregon?
In Oregon, and we're going to get there. So, and you get a box of barbiturates, a box of barbs that you hold on to, put in your closet. Hopefully your suicidal granddaughter doesn't get to it first. But that's physician-assisted suicide. And then the most common practice in the countries of the world that have been at this a while, specifically Canada and Benelux, is active euthanasia. There, the physician starts an intravenous line, just like a lethal execution in prison, and pushes a syringe full of toxic concoction of substances and kills you within 1 minute. So the doctor is an active, present administrator of death, lethal injection. And this, far and away, is the most common practice in the world today. So we're focusing specifically on these latter two this morning in the talk. And by the way, ethicists, this is one example of a paper, are very, very clear that the difference between the first, withdrawing treatment, and the active administration of either giving the patient a chemical gun or shooting them with that chemical gun, that is a very important, significant moral difference. Even though they both may result in death, that those pathways, those withdrawal pathways as opposed to administered pathways, are of very significant ethical difference. But basically the paradigm here is the patient wants to die and wants to have death given to them or given to themselves. And in psychiatry, we say that person is suicidal. Very familiar in my world. But in this case, the patient actually knocks on the door and rather than expects the physician to prevent that suicide, something which is in the fundamental ethos of what it means to be a psychiatrist, instead asks the physician to administer the suicide, administer the death, whether it's with a prescription or with a needle. So that's what we're talking about. Now let me tell you a little bit about what's happening in my country, in the United States. It's actually been very difficult to pass these laws as well, it should be. It should be even more difficult, frankly. Since 1994, 36 states in the U.S. Have looked at bills for this, and over 249 attempts have been rejected to pass these laws. As a matter of fact, in the last year alone, these states in the U.S. Defeated attempts to pass laws that allow physician-assisted suicide. Remember, that's what we're talking about in the United States. However, we have 8 states that allow it. And in all of those 8 states, the criteria are you have to be terminally ill, which is in itself a rather ambiguous term. It's said to be 6-month prognosis. But in point of fact, that kind of prognostication is difficult, very unreliable. And it's assisted suicide again. Write the prescription, the patient goes and takes it at their own time. So let's focus down on Oregon, because that's the model that seems to be in conversation, especially here in Sweden. I want you to understand that in the United States in general, Oregon in particular, this organization, Compassion and Choices, a very powerful organization, very highly funded organization, is almost single-handedly responsible for the development and pressure to pass these laws. The CEO, the director of this organization, just last month complained they're already too restrictive, these laws. She wrote, there are too many regulatory roadblocks ahead, and I'm suggesting we drop some of the regulations that put unnecessary roadblocks in place, reducing cumbersome reporting requirements. So this organization that has been able to stand up laws in these 8 jurisdictions, they feel the laws, even as they exist, as I'm going to show to you, are too restrictive and need to be softened even further. Right, so this is the story with Oregon. Through 2017, there's been 1,275 prescriptions written. Not all those prescriptions are taken. The dark bars are the prescriptions written, the light bars are the prescriptions taken. About 10% of the people are under age 55. It doesn't always work. In 6 cases, the patients labored for days with taking the barbiturates with all sorts of awful side effects and failed ultimately to reach their goal of dying. One patient did die, but only after 4 days. These are not necessarily easy and efficient things to take hundreds of barbiturates by mouth. They must be administered by mouth in Oregon and all the United States. Again, this is not euthanasia. Euthanasia is where you have an IV and somebody else kills you. This is self-administered. No requirement in Oregon for a physician to be present. Not to help make sure things go well, not to help make sure there's no coercion. No physician present in 84% of cases. Now, there was a tremendous acceleration right after 2014 that seemed to correlate very highly with quite a influential young woman, Brittany Maynard, who made a she had a YouTube video because she had a brain tumor and she wanted to have assisted dying, physician-assisted suicide. However, she lived in California. And California didn't have the law. So she was complaining and asking for it, and it became quite a national sensation in the United States. And it was in October 2014 that she released this video. It was in that month that in Oregon, these things are very influential in terms of their contagious effect. Because in Oregon, that month of October was the highest month of prescriptions requested for assisted suicide in the previous 5 years. And in fact, that month was 40% higher requests than in the average of the previous monthly average for the entire year. So there was a strong correlation of a huge bump in interest as this became public. So that's what you get with that sudden acceleration after 2014. Now, you see here that there are prescriptions that are used and prescriptions that are unused. And the question is, what happens to those prescriptions that are unused? Where do they go? Well, the fact of the matter is, we do not know. Nobody knows what happens. There's no regulation in any of the US states to in any way track what happens to those medications, see if they're diverted. Like I said, the suicidal granddaughter who finds the box of barbs in the closet, we have no information. Once they're dispensed from the pharmacy, they disappear from tracking. Most of the patients there are very well educated who get this and are white. Pain is merely the motivation. We're going to come back to that in a minute. It's not popular among physicians. Only 1% of physicians are actually participating in making this part of their practice compared to the Netherlands, where there's 60%. There are actually just a handful of physicians that are remarkably active. As a psychiatrist, makes me wonder about what might be part of that psychology. 3 physicians write 20% of the prescriptions. One doctor wrote 89 of them, and several, they're exclusive practices of this. So 2 of them came out of retirement and saw this as an appropriate post-retirement mission to make a specialty practice in providing assisted suicide. The length of the relationship between doctors and patients is very broad, as little as 4 days. The average is about 13 weeks, but there's no requirement about the length of time. You can see a physician for the first time this afternoon. Doctor has never met you before, doesn't really know you, listens to your case, and could, by the end of the appointment, write a prescription for a chemical gun for you. Now, in the law, as is the case with all of the U.S., the 8 jurisdictions, in Oregon, which started all of this, it is optional to refer a patient to someone like me, a psychiatrist. Why would they be referred? 2 reasons. One is if the evaluating physician, the general physician, thinks that a person might have problems with capacity and wants to know, are they capable of reasoning for this? Or 2, thinks they may have a psychiatric disorder. and then to refer to a psychiatrist, again, is optional, not required by law. Well, in the first couple of years, people were very concerned about this, so about 33% of cases were referred to psychiatrists, but then that referral pattern completely trickled off, disappeared, and went down to between 0 and 4% of patients ever end up getting evaluated by psychiatrists. And yet, there's been many studies, this being one in particular in the Lancet that looked at 50,000 patients to see how accurate general physicians are at being able to pick up the presence of a psychiatric disorder. And it turns out they're actually not that accurate. 53% of the time they missed the presence of a treatable psychiatric disorder. So in terms of the filter, the accuracy with which primary physicians are capable of detecting a potentially treatable psychiatric disorder, they're not very good. So a colleague of mine, Linda Ganzini, in Oregon, asked this organization, that's such a positive promoter of this, to give us a sample of their best cases of people who had gotten the prescription but hadn't used it yet, so that they could evaluate whether or not there might be some missing examples of missed psychiatric diagnosis. They were referred, 58 patients were referred, and they narrowed it down to 48 because 8 of them had died by the time they interviewed them. And it turned out that about a third of them met the criteria for a treatable psychiatric depression at the time of the interview that were missed by the doctors who had written them the lethal prescription that had not yet been used. You all following that? Okay, so the fact is that the cases are not being picked up. All of those patients that were diagnosed by this team as having a treatable depression were offered psychiatric care, free psychiatric care. And of all those patients, only one of them said, okay, I'll take treatment. They took treatment. After a number of sessions with a psychiatrist, they decided that, I'm feeling better, feeling different, and they did not actually end up using the prescription. Is this mine? It is now. Okay. People are always asked, what are your reasons for wanting this? That's part of the survey and the evaluation process. So, in Oregon and Washington, which was the next state to do this, the top 5 reasons: fear of losing my autonomy as my disease progresses, fear of being unable to engage in daily activities, fear of losing dignity, fear that I might become a burden to the family. All very frequent, but far less frequent is people who are currently in pain. I'm in pain and I want to help for pain. So the fact is, the top reasons are primarily fear. This is something which we in mental health professions are very familiar with. We understand how to deal with anxiety. We understand existential dread. We actually have a skill set to be able to administer to that, but as I've explained to you, the law does not in any way require patients whatsoever to have an encounter with the likes of me. So, and yet, the primary reasons for wanting assisted suicide in Oregon and Washington and in other jurisdictions that have studied this are psychological reasons. Montaigne said, he who fears he shall suffer already suffers what he fears. The law continues to expand as it does wherever it's struck. The law grows and expands. So here is a bill introduced in Oregon that is authorizing for people who can't administer to themselves, trying to see if we can allow other people, including physicians, to administer to them. In other words, as I've defined it before, euthanasia. So what began as physician-assisted suicide, and everybody's aware, we won't have no, we don't do euthanasia here, as if there's a significant moral difference, and we can discuss that because I think most people who think seriously about this believe there's really no moral difference whether a physician prescribes a gun that you use on yourself or takes the gun and shoots you with it. But nevertheless, now there's push for euthanasia in Oregon, and to change the definition to what I'm about to show you is a more Canadian model. example, where we no longer say terminal illness, 6 months, which again is in itself a somewhat questionable concept, something rather arbitrary, but to say, well, just let's make it vague. Let's say you have a condition that could result in your death. Last month, Oregon, 2019, now cooking in the equivalent building in Oregon to this building that we sit in now. It's an interesting case, a dreadful case of a woman in Oregon who wanted $4,000 chemotherapy to keep her alive 4 more months so she could make it to the wedding of her niece, and the medical paying authority, the Medicaid authority, who was reviewing the costs, said, no, we're not going to pay for you to have 4 more months of life at the cost of $4,000, but we will pay $50 for your box of barbs. And that was all over the news. Now, this issue is thanks to somebody that we have sitting in the room here, Mr. Fabian Stahl, who's very active in this issue here in your country and in mine, as a matter of fact. He inquired of the Oregon Health Authority. He said, look, let's say if a person has diabetes, for example, and they wanted to just stop their medication, and that result meant that they might die, that they would become terminally ill if they didn't take their insulin. Would that person be legally eligible for assisted suicide in the country? Doesn't have a terminal illness till he made himself terminal. And he wrote to the Oregon Health Authority. I'm not going to read all this. Essentially, the answer is yes. And it's yes because it's always yes. In all of the countries that we're looking at today, the foundational medical ethics, the right to refuse treatment, remains intact. Indeed, as well it should. That is, if you want to talk about autonomy, that is autonomy. People having, assuming they're of sound mind, the right to refuse treatment. But if that treatment maintains your life, dialysis, insulin, and could maintain your life for years, so that with the treatment you are not terminally ill, but without the treatment you are, in all of those jurisdictions, you then become eligible if you stop your treatment, because you can say what treatments are acceptable and not acceptable, so that you can induce a terminal illness and be eligible. Now, you might say, well, that's not very, it wouldn't be ethical for a physician to write such a prescription, and I would certainly agree with you. Frankly, I think none of this is consistent with medical ethics. It may not be ethical, but it is legal. These laws do not care how you become terminally ill. Indeed, some of those other countries, you don't even have to be terminally ill in the first place, but in the US you do. And in any place where you have to become terminally ill, making yourself terminally ill is a legally, if not ethically, acceptable route to achieve that. Okay, now if we look at Oregon, if we look at ordinary suicide, non-assisted suicide, wild type of suicide, the suicide kind of issue that I deal with every day as a psychiatrist, after the law was struck, at first there was a drop in the ordinary suicides, and then they started to pick up again. And not only did they pick up again, but they picked up again at a rate much faster than the rest of the United States general population. In fact, if you look at just the age range 23 to 64, the rate of suicide increased 75% faster in Oregon than elsewhere. Now, cause and effect, I don't know. Correlation is not causation, as we say in medicine, but we certainly do understand that there is a phenomenon called suicide contagion. Suicides influence other people to have suicides. As a matter of fact, that same organization, the CDC, that public health organization, whose definition of suicide I showed you, that organization even has written guidelines for the media about how to report on suicide so that you are least likely to inflame suicide contagion in the readership, because we know that this is a very well-studied phenomenon. All right, so some of the problems then, to summarize in Oregon, we've looked at a few. No requirement for psychiatric assessment. No requirement for palliative care. 14% in the last 10 years in Oregon were not enrolled in any palliative care, possibly because they couldn't access it. Access to palliative care is a big issue, an issue that I want the Parliament here to consider what that situation might be here in Sweden. We said there's no minimum time for a doctor-patient relationship. You could come in and 30 minutes later have your prescription, having met the doctor for the first time. Doctor shopping is allowed. If you see a doctor and you want to get this, and the doctor says, I don't think that this is appropriate, and so forth, you can walk down the street and go to another doctor. And as a matter of fact, we need two opinions, and the second opinion doctor can be the partner in the same medical practice as that first doctor. Not really a truly independent second opinion, is it? There's no requirement to consult a specialist in prognosis, like an oncologist, who may be in the best position to say, well, this is 6 months, or this is not 6 months. Sometimes it does take a specialist in that particular disease to say whether or not you're terminally ill. No such requirement. In Oregon, there's no requirement for training in how to assess capacity, whether a person has the mental ability. And let me explain something to you. Capacity assessment in psychiatry is a specialty. It's part of the subspecialty called forensic psychiatry. And there's a great deal of training, experience, and nuance that goes into capacity assessment. And by the way, what we have learned about how to assess capacity is not in the context of people deciding to take their lives. It's in things like, can you refuse surgery, things that may not be quite so dire. But it is such a specialty that I, a psychiatrist, who am not a forensic psychiatrist, I do not feel qualified in doing a capacity assessment. And yet, in Oregon, and in fact in every jurisdiction that we're talking about this morning, there is no requirement for any specialized training. Whatever doctor the person is going to, whatever the attending physician is simply left to their own decision as to whether or not that patient has capacity. No special training required. In Oregon, you're not allowed to say on the death certificate that a person died by assisted suicide. The death certificate has to reflect the underlying illness for which the prescription was justified. So, as a result, we are really actually not able to even accurately track what's going on there. To know if it's an assisted suicide, a doctor has to fill out a separate form to say, oh, I have this patient who has assisted suicide, not on the death certificate, and oftentimes doctors are not following through. So we don't even actually have the full picture. There is no mechanism to assess coercion. And as a matter of fact, there's no definition of coercion. Where the encouragement becomes coercion is very subtle, right? Grandma, yes, you can do this. You can take a few more. Let me help you with this. Let me just encourage you. Or, Grandma, you promised that you would do this. We were waiting for your inheritance. Maybe you wouldn't say that out loud. We were waiting for your inheritance. Grandma, you said you would do this yesterday, and now it's already today. Where do you cross the line from encouragement to coercion? It's subtle, it's not spelled out by law, and there's no requirement for any independent observer to be around to monitor that. We talked about how patients become terminal the law doesn't care. You make yourself terminal, and we talked about the problem of what happens to these medications if they're not used, where are they stored, how can they be diverted or misused. All right, let's progress on to another nation, to Canada. Now, Canada decided they're not going to get too into the weeds when it comes to terminal and defining terminal. They came up with this term that they invented that's unique to Canada, although as you saw, Oregon is being inspired by their neighbors just to the north. That the idea that the cause of the illness, death has to be in the reasonably foreseeable future. Nobody knows what that means. The Parliament didn't spell it out. The Supreme Court didn't spell it out when it charged parliaments with making their C-14 law, which came online in 2016. Somehow or another, this death in the foreseeable future, it's kind of towards the end of life. But the fact of the matter is, since it's not spelled out, we already have one case in Canada which was given euthanasia with maybe a 4-year prognosis, another case with a 6-year prognosis, and neither of those are considered illegitimate because nobody knows what death in the foreseeable future means. Instead, the focus is, in the European model, as we'll see shortly, that the illness has to be intolerable to the person, they can't stand it, and has to be untreatable. Remember, the patient, of course, gets to weigh in on what's intolerable. But remember, the standard of medical ethics, the patient also gets part of the vote as to what's treatable, because the patient can refuse treatment. Chemotherapy, no thank you. Dialysis, no thank you. In those places that have psychiatric euthanasia, electroconvulsive therapy, that's going to say to me, no thank you, I don't want that. If that's all you got, then I guess I'm untreatable. That is preserved in, again, these become important things if terminal is not the main issue. And in Canada, as in all the other places we're about to talk about, it's euthanasia. It's almost exclusively euthanasia. Given an option of euthanasia, that's what people want. In fact, in 2017, not one single case of assisted suicide by prescription were all lethal injections. You can see how it's taken off. In 2017 alone, for the first half of the year to the second half of the year, there was a 20% increase. There were over 2,600 cases of euthanasia in Canada. And so in that year, 1 out of every 100 human beings who die in Canada are killed by a doctor at the sharp end of a euthanasia needle. 1 out of every 100. That is a rather low number, as we shall soon see, compared to elsewhere. Now, before we leave Canada, I want to alert you to something specific about one of their provinces, Ontario. So this is what happens. This is the second stage of euthanasia in countries that begin to set this up. I call it euthanasia 2.0. Because what happens next is, first the College of Physicians and Surgeons said that if you are a conscientious objector and you do not want to be part of the system of referral, if a patient comes to you and say, I want this, and you say, I don't do that, this medical organization said, you are unethical if you don't say to the patient, I'll refer you to somebody who might be willing to do it. You have to be part of the chain of referral. So the conscientious objectors took it to court, and the court agreed. Not with them, they agreed that it is legal to forbid conscientious objection in that way. That you might have your medical license threatened if you didn't at least say, okay, I'll find you somebody that might be willing to do it. So this is a testimony from a colleague of mine to the legislature of Ontario. She writes, at my institution, physicians are being bullied into accepting the role of the responsible physician for MAID. Remember, that's what they call it, medical assistance in dying. There's a horrendous stress level at our hospital. Physicians are afraid to speak up, afraid they will lose their jobs if they say anything. We feel sometimes like we're in some sort of dystopian novel. In fact, they had to create an organization, Protection of Conscience Project. Their director has said it is the refusing to kill patients that now requires justification in Canada. The head of the Saskatchewan College of Physicians and Surgeons says if doctors and have conscientious objections, maybe they shouldn't be doctors. If you're squeamish about this, we have a whole new paradigm in medicine now. You shouldn't become a doctor. And the secretary of the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario, which is where this conscientious objection thing is taking place, basically has said, if you are in a specialty where you might be asked by a patient to do this, and you're uncomfortable, change specialties. Go back and retrain. Get a new education. Become a pathologist so you can deal with patients after they die. So you don't have to deal with this question before they die. So what's happened is the balance between unacceptable and acceptable murder and suicide begins to shift. So that you can see here this interesting cartoon by Amy Hasbrook, man in a wheelchair. On the left is the suicide prevention program. On the right is the assisted suicide center. Notice which side the ramp is on for his wheelchair. the distinction between whether death is hastened by a medical professional or by the suffering person is becoming essentially meaningless and irrelevant, says this Canadian ethicist. And as a result, we now see in Canada people coming to the emergency room with suicidal behaviors and suicidal thinking, and the doctors in the emergency room deciding, you know, we're coming to think of suicide differently. Maybe suicide is just the person saying, I don't want to have treatment anymore, and sending patients home, rather than admitting them for treatment in the hospital. Because of this shifting balance. And we've seen a number of cases now, cases like this man whose wife asked for assisted suicide. The doctors did not feel like she was eligible, did not believe that, so he killed her himself, right? I mean, after all, it's acceptable to kill some people who are in extreme end of life, so if the doctors won't do it, I'll do it. The threshold for what constitutes acceptable murder or acceptable suicide has changed. I'm going to, in the interest of time, skip this next part. I do want to mention before we leave Canada that now, just as in Europe, organ donation is being linked to euthanasia, a virtue opportunity to take the tragedy of your illness in your life and give the gift of life to someone else. And now in this New England Journal article, the Canadian physicians and ethicists are arguing, the best kind of organ donation is a live organ donation, not after someone dies. So now the proposal in Canada is to allow live organ donation for euthanasia. In other words, euthanasia by organ donation. How are you going to die? How is your doctor going to kill you? By removing your kidneys, by removing your heart, and donating it to somebody while you're still alive. Anesthesia, take out your organs, and then let death come on the operating table. As the new facilitated virtue pathway that euthanasia has opened in this tremendous civilization-changing maneuver. Now, let's look at an even more dire situation, the slippery slope from the living laboratories of the Netherlands and Belgium. In 2002, all of these countries developed similar laws. They also got rid of the whole discussion between terminal and non-terminal. Let's not talk about terminal anymore. Let's replace, you don't have to be terminal. Let's just say if a person has a condition that's insufferable, unbearable to them, and untreatable. And I talked to you about the complexities of that word. That's all. Forget terminal. Okay? So let's say, which ironically we psychiatrists have been saying for a while, let's remove the distinctions between physical and mental suffering. Suffering is suffering is suffering. That opened euthanasia to people with chronic diseases, psychiatric conditions, children, and advanced directives. And in those countries, it's almost exclusively euthanasia. In fact, we can see here in the Netherlands, the dramatic growth since 2002. There's been a 350% increase. In fact, in 2017, almost 5 out of every human beings who die in the Netherlands die by the hands of a physician to produce that death. And that may be underreported. In this article in the New England Journal, as many as 23% of cases are believed to be unreported. And as I say, they allow psychiatric patients there, schizophrenia, manic depression, and so forth. But even going further down the list, the more minor conditions like attention deficit disorder and autistic spectrum disorders, those cases, some of them have been allowed euthanizing. This does not include dementia. If you include dementia, which I actually would as a psychiatric disorder, the numbers are much larger. And this is Belgium, a 900% increase. In Belgium, in the Flanders region, over 6 out of every 100 human beings dies by the hands of a physician. Now, from 2015 to 2016, there was a huge jump of 14% there. And there, according to the same New England Journal article, as many as 40% of cases are not being reported. And if you look at the psychiatric cases, there was a 22% increase just between 2015 and 16, a big jump there. The majority are female. That can lead to some interesting discussion as to where that would be. 2 out of every 3 had mood disorders, half of whom had personality disorders.
Excuse me, can I ask, For the question, is that all right, or should I wait until
Let's wait. Let me just wrap up here. So we talked about suicide contagion in the Netherlands. In Oregon, the same may be happening in the Netherlands. All of these other countries, the suicide rate is going down. In the Netherlands, since they had their law, the suicide rate is gradually increasing. 20% increase compared to Finland and France and Germany and Denmark, kind of surrounding countries with some similar demographics. So again, correlation is not causation, but it certainly appears. And in Belgium, 2 twins were euthanized after going blind. Here's a person who was unhappy about being homosexual, and he was considered to have an insufferable, untreatable condition. He was allowed euthanasia. Here's a man with a gender identity disorder, had 3 attempts at surgical gender transformation. He was unhappy with those attempts. He was allowed euthanasia. And indeed, we even had a case of somebody without a medical condition, a rapist who was in prison for life, couldn't stand being in prison, insufferable, had a life sentence, untreatable, there's no change. He was allowed to have euthanasia, although that was aborted at the last minute. And to go further down the rabbit hole, the Minister of Health and the Minister of Justice in the Netherlands say, look, let's go beyond medical. Let's have just people who say, completed life. Forget about terminal and illness. My life is complete, or I'm tired of living. They're pushing for that, and they're pushing for an over-the-counter suicide pill, which as a physician makes me slightly more comfortable to get it out of the house of medicine. If a society chooses to do this, I believe it should not be turning to physicians to do that. So this is how the slope slips. It starts with the terminally ill and progresses to the non-terminal. Distinctions between physical and mental suffering removed. Children, which we didn't get into, are allowed in Belgium and the Netherlands, and advanced directives, 18 years in advance. Mandated referral by conscientious objectors is in Canada. The allowing of psychiatric patients with major mental illnesses like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, then minor conditions like attention deficit disorder, then uncomfortable lifestyles like going blind or being homosexual or having alcoholism, prisoners with life sentences, then proxy consent by people who are incapacitated. I didn't have a chance to tell you about that in Belgium, where family members say, you know what, they can't speak for themselves, but surely I wouldn't want to live like that. Go ahead and do the euthanasia. And then mercy killing by doctors who can't find any family members and decide for themselves to do this. And then completed life and tired of living and the over-the-counter suicide pill and so forth. I'm just skipping a couple of things because I want to say a couple of things about ethics the way I see it. Unethical ethics are better than no ethics at all. I don't know if I agree with that. The fact of the matter is the core of medical ethics began, and the tree out of which the house of medicine is built was rooted in the Hippocratic origins, with the Hippocratic Oath. And this, like the tree of Christianity, being rooted in the cult of Jesus Christ and all of the values that articulated, and came to suffuse the mighty oak of Christianity over the next couple of millennia. An even older tradition is the tradition venerable of medical ethics that has been cultivated, that has been developed, that has been refined and resourced over the years, but it started with an oath that physicians still take, the core of which was this statement: I will not give a fatal drug to anyone if I'm asked, neither will I counsel any man to do so, because in ancient Greece, all the other medical centers practiced euthanasia. But this center, if you wanted to join them, you had to join a covenantal community, to be part of a covenant that expressed certain values. The key value that distinguished this group from all the other groups was this particular value. So this isn't just a random value. This isn't like some of the other things of the oath. This was definitional and has remained definitional, and to this day is supported by major organizations. The World Medical Association says euthanasia and assisted suicide are unethical and should be condemned, and that the physician who does it is unethical. The American Medical Association, arguably one of the most influential in the world, says it's incompatible with the physician's role as a healer. My organization, I actually helped to craft this statement, says a psychiatrist should not prescribe or administer any intervention to a non-terminally ill person for the purpose of causing death. By the way, we said non-terminally ill, we're against it all, but we made a special statement to send a message to Belgium and to the Netherlands and to try to get ahead of what we see as a metastasis of something that we expect to spread to the United States. This is the ruling principle. What happens in a society that becomes secular, it needs new things to worship, and so it makes new ideas and principles sacred. This is the current sacred principle of autonomy, which is important, a very important principle. But as Charles Foster at Oxford, the famous ethicist, said, autonomy grew up as a street fighter and was bloodied in some genuinely noble battles against medical paternalism, but like so many rulers, it has quickly forgotten its democratic roots and grown fat and brutal in power. Because there are many other important principles in medical ethics, in social ethics, justice and fairness, doing no harm, suicide prevention, and so forth. And what happens is you run autonomy too fast off the rails, and it crushes all of those other principles. Because in fact, it's a pseudo-autonomy. The patient may ask, okay, but ultimately it's the doctor who decides. The physician who decides what's unbearable. Okay, that guy can't stand it. I think this guy can stand it. And what's untreatable? It's a doctor ultimately who decides. And so it all hinges on the idiosyncratic beliefs and opinions of just a few people. So it's still the doctors who retain the power. No wonder they want that to transcend and become non-medicalized in Europe. This is why people living with disabilities are so fearful of legalized assisted suicide and other forms of medical killing. It's the assault to their dignity that comes with the social sanction of the idea that lives characterized by incontinence, cognitive incapacity, dependence on others are unworthy of life, and so can be ended by direct killing. We throw a question smack in the face of the disabled everywhere. Why are you still burdening yourself and us with your life? You have an alternative now. I just want to say, I'm not going to linger on this slide, that I believe this is a fundamental inversion of my particular specialty's ethos, which is to prevent suicide, not to provide it. To find a path to a better future, or to suffer with a person. That's what the word compassion means. What is it? Compassion. You suffer with, and we psychiatrists are very experienced at suffering with our patients, and as my wife who's in the back of the room can tell you, it keeps me up at night. We actually even have a skill set in psychiatry, independent of what your diagnosis is, of helping people make meaning of suffering. So, if a society, there's a freedom and there are rights. Freedoms are things that a society can't interfere with, like owning private property. A right is something which, if society gives you, it has a duty to help you fulfill that right. If you have the right to vote, society has to provide a mechanism for you to vote. Suicide heretofore has been a freedom, but these societies are converting it from a freedom to a right. So, if there's a right, the question is, who has the duty? Because there's always a duty that comes with the right. Is it the physician's duty? And I say to you, no. That is not what we do. We do not kill in the House of Medicine. So if it's not the physician's duty, whose duty is it? And then if a government wants to go in this direction, which I strongly advise you not to, then a government has a duty, in which case it can stand up a separate class of practitioners. This was the Sanson family, 5 generations of royal executioners who were able to do the deed, which we call laicide, get it out of the House of Medicine if you must. So I'm going to actually not go through this slide in detail because it sort of summarizes things that I've already said, and I'm running short on time. But I do want to make one additional point that's on this slide, which is the next to the last point, moral outsourcing, right? So the taboo against suicide, frankly, is an important part of suicide prevention, that we don't want people to do it, and there should be a social taboo against it. When you medicalize suicide, you are morally outsourcing to the medical community to say, okay, it's taboo for us to do it, so we're going to take a step to the side. We're going to make the doctors say that it's okay. And that lowers the threshold, changes the bar, changes the fulcrum between what is acceptable and unacceptable suicide, and creates an inconsistency so that some people are allowed suicide and other people are not. And try having that hold up in court for very long. It doesn't. And hold up in ethical thinking and in societies that value and cherish fairness. Suicide is an individual act and self-motivated and self-administered, so its force field is contained. Euthanasia, by contrast, is the product of society. When it goes wrong for everyone. Even as law and culture make euthanasia seem more normal, it remains among the most unfamiliar acts a society can condone. Euthanasia could become a bludgeon, swinging through people's lives, whose handiwork cannot be undone. This may be the euthanasia of medical ethics as we know it. As Julius Caesar says in Shakespeare, men have lost their reason, my heart is in the coffin there. Because each man's death diminishes me, for I am involved in mankind, and therefore send not to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. Sweden, do not let the bell toll for you. Do not join this parade to death. I leave you with the words of Winston Churchill. Never give up, never give up, never, 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 never.